It's live, so the milliseconds matter.
Sports is where AI has no excuses. It runs live at scale under pressure. Today's guest is Julie Sousa, Global Head of Sports at Amazon Web Services.
If it's not solving a business problem, then it's theater, right? If it's just technology for technology's sake, it's not interesting. In the case of F1, that's 1.1 million points of data per second coming off of over 300 sensors on each car. In the Bundesliga, it's about 3.6 million points of data per match come in and into the cloud and are processed. So we have huge volumes of data. We've been able to process it with almost negligible latency. Senior executives say we wanted to lean into a particular technology because we heard of the work you do with Bundesliga or PGA Tour or F1.
Welcome to Digital Storm Weekly, the podcast for leaders who don't want buzzwords but decisions. I'm Jörg Schramm, and today's guest is Julie Sousa, Global Head of Sports at Amazon Web Services. Sports is where AI has no excuses. It runs live at scale under pressure, and Julie operates exactly at that edge. Julie, why should a CEO listen to this podcast? Maybe you can explain this in the next 30 seconds.
I think, what we do in sport allows us to tell very technical stories and stories with real business outcomes in a really accessible way through the storytelling vehicle of sport. We've had many senior executives say we wanted to lean into a particular technology because we heard of the work you do with Bundesliga or PGA Tour or F1. So I think there will hopefully be some good nuggets coming out of this discussion.
Sounds like a very interesting topic. Okay, good. Let's start directly with some rapid fire questions. Just answer very quickly. One AI use case in sport that delivers undeniable value today.
I think we're seeing a lot in this space around player health and safety and being able to use AI tools to simulate and create different scenarios whereby player health and safety can be improved, particularly in the game of American football.
One AI use case in sport that looks impressive, but is mostly theater.
It's hard to say because I think some of these things are trial and error. But I will say this in generic terms: if it's not solving a business problem, then it's theater, right? If it's just technology for technology's sake, it's not interesting. It's got to solve a business problem.
Yeah. One metric sports executives overtrust in measuring AI impact.
I think looking for instant returns on it, because sometimes you've got to make that initial investment to yield return a little further down the road. So I think immediate returns is probably not the right metric to look at. You have to look at the long-term play.
One reason sports is much harder AI environment than most enterprises.
I think it's live, right? I know it's live.
Huh?
It's live, so milliseconds matter. So I just think and there's also a lot of passion behind it. So you can't get it wrong, right? A lot of eyeballs, a lot of passion. You've got to be real time.
One capability business leaders outside sport should urgently copy.
Look, I think it all goes back to making sure that you understand why you're investing in a certain technology, right? I think, you've seen widespread cloud adoption. So if you're still on-prem, you need to be thinking about getting to the cloud so that you can scale and be more efficient and more sustainable. So I would say at a general level, for those businesses that have not yet adopted cloud, the way some of the leading sports properties have across the world, they should be rapidly developing a plan to do so.
Okay. Julie, you have worked across sports, media analytics, and also now cloud infrastructure at AWS. What belief about sports tech did you have to unlearn once you saw AI operating live?
Well, I think there's a lot of things in sport where it's done with your gut, right? So you trust your gut to be true. So I think many people in the sports ecosystem had to become much more comfortable with reading and believing data. Always test, there should be a human in the loop analyzing the outputs of this. But to go from a, gut culture where we believe things just because it's the way it always has been, to looking at data and believing those insights and acting on those insights, I think that's a real shift we've seen.
And if you look to your own career, what career decision looked risky at the time shaped how you now lead AWS Sports globally?
So I used to lead business development at ESPN, a big distributor of sports content here in the US. And I had met a startup company in that work that was really doing a lot of this semantic analysis against tracking data in sport. And that shift, I remember sitting there learning about how much data they were collecting. And it was sort of a light bulb moment where I said to myself, wow, this is going to change everything. This granularity and volume of data is going to change things drastically. I don't know quite how, at the time, but I knew it was an inflection point in sport. And I left ESPN and I went to go work for them because it was so interesting and, continue to get to do some of that work today.
Okay. Pretty interesting times right now, yeah? And if you look at the last 2 years, what do you think? What changed more, the tech itself or the willingness of the leagues to redesign how decisions are made?
I think the technology has changed so rapidly. We weren't talking about AI in this way, 2 or 3 years ago, right? With that. And so there's always, the technology is there, but then there's always the lag of change management, if you will, people feeling comfortable and adopting it. I will say the length of time for people to start, experimenting and adopting and, leaning into new technology, I think that window has accelerated quite a bit as well. So as the technology has been released much more rapidly, I think so has a willingness to adopt that.
I think when executives hear AWS in sport, they think always about cloud hosting first. Hey, can you explain in concrete terms what AWS actually enables now, what was not possible before?
There is so much. Yes, we are cloud infrastructure, but we very much are a leader in the AI space. And so when I look at some of the examples, I'll give a very concrete one. When you look at both Bundesliga and the PGA Tour are experimenting with using AI to help create more content to serve their fans. In the case of golf, it's very difficult. You've got potentially 156 golfers, on 18 different fields of play during a golf tournament, and being able to capture content around all of those players, that's not easily scalable, at least not in an economically feasible way. So leveraging the data that they're able to pull off the course and applying generative AI tools to be able to create content to push out to their fans at unprecedented levels, we're seeing that happen, and at a fraction of the cost. So that's just one example where AI is helping properties produce content that fans are asking for, but prior to this technology were not economically or practically reasonable for them to be able to produce.
Okay, it looks like you directly answered my next question, because I wanted to ask you, can you walk us through an end-to-end example where you capture data, process the data, model, and deliver it to real-time to the fans? Do you have any other example to the one you just mentioned?
Yeah, I think what you're hitting on a really interesting point too, which is you're first capturing that data and then how do you deploy that data? How do you use that data? What questions do you ask of it? That is a starting point in many of our conversations. And so whether it's, the example I just illustrated with creating content for fans, there's also creating content capturing the data to inform player health and safety, as I alluded to a little bit earlier. And those are really remarkable stories, being able to mine injury data from the game of American football, understand which plays are more injurious, and then take action, right? The league has actually banned plays they have found to be more injurious. They have changed rules to optimize for lower injury rates. In the case of F1, that's 1.1 million points of data per second coming off of over 300 sensors on each car. That data, it's a tremendous volume of data, right? So being able to use it to drive insights like F1 Insights for fan engagement, and yet that same data feeds, work around computational fluid dynamics to help redesign the F1 car to optimize for overtakes, right? So you're starting to see all of these really interesting and compelling use cases. It sort of just depends on where you sit in the ecosystem. If you are a governing body, you are looking at, athlete health and performance. You're looking at rule changes. You're looking at equipment changes and innovation. If officiating applications there for sure. If you are a team or a club, that's game strategy, it's scouting, it's recruiting, it's training. And if you're talking to fans, how do we use this data to drive engagement and edify the audiences and make them better understand and appreciate what they're watching? A lot of use cases in there.
Okay. I would like to go on the NFL topic. I think AWS powers long-running programs like the NFL Next Gen Stats. How long do you working with them? together already?
We've been working with the league for quite some time. I will say that this is the 10th, this year celebrates the
And
10th
yeah,
anniversary of Next Gen Stats.
yeah.
So it's a significant anniversary. But what's interesting is that it's almost become the gold standard, right? The next gen stats became sort of the proxy for these analytics that, drive fan engagement. And as a matter of fact, I'm going next week to the NFL Combine, where the big data bowl happens, which is where it's sort of like a hackathon for data scientists and ML engineers to work with a subset of NFL data to create insights that feed the next gen stat, if you will.
Okay.
So it's always growing.
Okay. So you said you're working with them together since 10 years. What did you learn in those 10 years about the limits of AI?
Look, I mean, AI in general has been in sport for quite some time, right? It's just as the technology gets more powerful, you're always learning. I think we're somewhat only limited, as I mentioned before, by our imagination and what we ask of this data. But things like, starting with, hey, we want to make the game safer, it gives you another level of questioning, which is, well, okay, what's unsafe now? Or asked another way, what is causing high injury rates? Well, we know concussions are a problem, right? Okay, so that impact to the head largely. Well, let's look at the helmets, right? And understand how they play a role here. And interestingly, it used to be that every player had the same type of helmet. But if you think about it, different positions are going to absorb hits differently. That mean that those helmets probably should be redesigned for the specific position, which is what happens now.
Oh,
Right
so
now, there are about 7 different position-specific helmets in the NFL that protect the players in those roles in a much more specific and helpful way.
okay. You mentioned also Bundesliga before. This I heard, yeah, the German. I think the Bundesliga match facts powered by AWS is a flagship in football. Yeah, what architecture pattern turns the raw data inside into something what fans really understand?
So the data is captured through optical tracking through cameras in the Bundesliga stadiums or arenas. And all of that data, it's about 3.6 million points of data per match, come in and into the cloud and are processed, and creating models to be able to understand keeper efficiency and all the different metrics that are going to help fans understand the game a little bit better, the match a little bit better. And so I think what we've seen, the use cases of that data have gone beyond just beyond the insights, the match facts, but also being able to contextualize those and leveraging AI to be able to create more contextual insights. The data comes off Harry Kane's 16th goal. Okay, that's the raw data coming in. Well, then we're able to go back and use AI tooling to say, all right, based on that raw data prompt, what does this contextualize this goal? And AI is able to come back and say, this is Harry Kane's, 16th goal. He's on pace to hit 35 this season, which puts him in the top 3 goal scorers so far in the season. So that sort of generated context is coming not from humans, but from the AI tooling that's referencing this data and contextualizing it against a larger trove of historical data that the league holds.
I remember when I was at AWS reInvent, I saw your booth about Bundesliga, where you can change the languages in
Yeah,
for the
I love that.
game, and super impressive. Yeah, really, you get
Well, and
real-time
that's a nice
translation.
Yeah, that's a nice part of it too, is once we have this data, and they were so early in this space where they were not only pulling in this data, providing that contextualization through AI, but then using AI tools to then translate those into other languages using local vernacular. And they went one step further to say, I'm not just going to translate this into Italian, I'm going to and German and English. Well, it doesn't need to be translated to some of those, but right, Italian and Latvian and whatever languages they'd like to translate to, but we're going to do it in different personas as well.
Academic or
right. They had one that they called, what do they call it now? I think they used to call it bro. So it was a little bit of like a casual sports fan view, right? So you could start talking to people in the language that they prefer, the tone of voice that they prefer. And what that does is drive fandom and affinity, right? People feel closer to their teams and to the property, and that is good for sport.
Interesting use case. But coming to business, corporate business, from a corporate business perspective, where does the real value concentrate on the engagement, performance, monetization, or operation? What do you think?
Yes.
On all.
I think where we're seeing early gains is in productivity and efficiency gains, right? So especially when you look at some of the AI tooling around coding, right? You don't necessarily need a suite of developers coding baseline, for coding. You can deploy those folks on much more intricate and creative tasks. So we are seeing a lot in terms of operational efficiency, not just on the coding side, but just from a automating, tasks that aren't particularly value added perspective. And then on the monetization side, yes, I mean, the example I cited earlier with the PGA Tour being able to produce, where they, 1,200 articles a tournament, at 25 cents a piece. That is the more they, first of all, you've lowered the cost in producing that content. But you've also created a lot more content that can be monetized as it's, distributed through digital properties and things like that. And they're creating more sponsorable assets as well. So you're driving revenue that way.
We talked about the personalization topic before, yeah, from, for example, Bundesliga with a different language tone. I think personalization is everywhere in those sports app. Where do you think does it really create a lot of real value, or where could it also damage trust?
This is a wonderful question, and one I have been struggling with a little bit, because I think in the case of sport, where if you're a sports fan, I'm a sport fan, the reason, a big part of that is it creates this sense of community, right? And the shared experience, and a shared rooting interest, or a shared passion against the enemy, right? So when we get to this personalization, and I believe that there is great benefit in personalizing this content so that people can get their favorite matches, their favorite, games, teams delivered to them in the way that drives that affinity. We just have to be careful not to lose the shared experience, right? So, I talk about this data being able to, come in and help drive alternate broadcasts. So you can have a data cast if you are a sports data, fan. It could be a betting cast if you like to place bets on sports. It could be a fantasy version of the broadcast. We've seen animated broadcasts using the tracking data, replacing the players with characters from popular animated programs. So we see all these different versions of a game or a match, but then as long as the core of what we're watching is the same, the outcomes are the same, and you're able to have that shared connection with other fans, I think, there's probably a fine line there. But I do think having fans, especially with the adoption of streaming, being able to choose your own adventure, if you will, or choose the way you want to consume a content or sports, I think that's powerful. And especially when you can add sort of, I want to set the dials, right? Like I want to be prompted to place a bet. I want to be reminded to order, food a half hour before halftime or something. I would like to be able to chat with my friends. I'd like to be prompted to take polls. I'd like, when we win, to be prompted to buy my favorite player's kit or something, right? So there are all of these levels of interactivity you can put into a streaming environment that drives that personalized experience. But again, we don't want to lose the communal experience, because that's what makes sports special.
We're talking a lot about AI and Gen AI. I think they are entering now live production, research, and storytelling. What do you think is the right role today, and where is it still too risky to rely on Gen AI?
We're seeing massive progress in this space. And I think there's a couple of different things. One, you see, if you watch live sport being produced now, often there are big production trucks in the parking lots and whatnot. And that is a very terrestrially taxing thing to do. You are shipping a lot of equipment, you're using a lot of electricity, you're sending a lot of people, and it's fairly inflexible, right? You're producing a singular broadcast from a truck. We've seen great strides in people pushing those production workloads to the cloud, so that you can be more flexible. Once it's up there, I can produce alternate broadcasts, right? I don't have to send people on site. They can produce from their homes, actually, right? And so we're seeing that shift for sure. But then we're seeing further automation with, being able to have the data help steer camera angles and things like that. So that there is a lot happening in this space. And I only expect that will accelerate.
You mentioned this latency topic before. This brings me to one point. Yeah. What do you think is the most underestimated bottleneck? Data, quality of data, amount of data, latency, governance, talent, or maybe the change management, or anything else? What do you think? What is the most underestimated bottleneck?
Change management.
Change
It's always,
management?
yeah, I mean, I think people are used to doing things in a certain way. I
Yeah.
think there we go. And I think getting people comfortable with new technology or new ways of doing things is always difficult, right? It's always, I'll tell you, we were just talking about live cloud production as an example. It was possible to produce a game entirely in the cloud years ago. And I remember asking an executive whose league was leaning in on this. I said, a lot of people are doing these proofs of concept. I'm like, we've proved the concept. Why is this not yet how people, produce live sporting event?
Mm, mm.
And the answer was change is hard, right? So we have huge volumes of data. We've been able to process it with sub-second, with almost negligible latency. A lot of those problems are already solved. But sort of enacting it, I think, is always the harder part, is getting people
Change
to
management.
understand and trust and deploy.
Okay. Any advice how to take the people with you on that
Well,
journey?
I mean, I think it's got to be an willingness and an openness to experiment and try, right? And understand where stakes are low and push the envelope. We had a sports property we worked with, and they really leaned in on this. They were willing. We did start with a proof of concept, and we learned some things there. And then we moved to doing a world feed in multiple languages to show how flexible this was. Again, sort of as a shadow production, but it got them to the point that they ultimately produced and distributed a game entirely in the cloud, and it let them free up the opportunity to produce an alternate broadcast, which then inspired their production or their distribution partners to produce their own alternate broadcasts. So there was a lot of goodness there, but being willing to start experimenting in this space and continuing to innovate to the point where, hey, this is good enough. We can put this out there, and that's certainly what we're seeing.
Okay, good. Julie, I think sport makes decisions in real time under global observation. Now, what do you think? What should CEOs copy from that operating cadence?
Well, I mean, I think so. We were used to getting data for very programmatic times, right? So even in sport, you would get the box score after the game, right? Now data is being fed to you real time, and you're able to react to it in real time. And I think that parallel certainly exists in the business world, especially if you're trying to respond to customer sentiment, or whether it's a marketing use case or customer service one. I think being able to use data in real time is applicable to any industry. And really think about it, healthcare, life sciences, financial services, all of them require facility with data and being able to respond to it and access it in the moment.
Okay. Believe you would walk into a non-sports company and had 90 days to show some AI impact. Which two use case patterns would you recommend?
That's a difficult question to answer, simply because, especially where we sit at AWS, we have a mantra. We always work back from the customer, right? So again, and I don't do this with our sports properties either. I don't necessarily give advice on technology as much as I try to understand the business problem they're trying to solve, and then we see where technology could be applied. So, maybe it's not a very direct answer, but I would always encourage experimentation for sure. But I'd want to understand what their problems are, and then we figure out, hey, can technology be deployed to help solve them? And a lot of times, yes. Sometimes, maybe no.
I think that is also the right answer. I would probably answer on this question too. Without knowing the detail in the business, very difficult to say anything. Yeah. Okay. 3 years from now on, do you think what will matter more in sports than in sports AI than most executives expect today?
This is a difficult one because, like I said, we didn't predict sort of the momentum that AI had, just 3 years ago. Look, I think I have learned not to underestimate the pace of innovation and the creativity in deploying technical tools. So I think you will see a lot more in the automated production space and the cloud-based production space. I think you will see a lot in personalization that drives fan experience in a deeper way. I also think just in general, globalization is a huge priority for sport. And so using technology to reach global audiences is something that should accompany what we're already seeing. I met with somebody from one of the Bundesliga teams. They have an office in New York City, right? Driving fandom in this community in the same way that, the American football had a game in Berlin last year and Munich the year before, right? So those are some of the trends I'm seeing, and I think that they'll only accelerate.
If our listeners remember one lesson from the sports world about AI,
that it's a tool that can really help be deployed against a lot of different, use cases or problems. And experimenting with it is important. How does it help us be more efficient? How does it help us onboard employees faster, code more quickly, reach fans in interesting and engaging ways? My advice would always be to lean in and experiment, find a trusted partner, and start with a business problem and work backwards from there.
Okay, Julie, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
That's it for today's Digital Storm Weekly. If there's one takeaway, it is sports is not just entertainment. It's the most unforgiving lab for real-time AI under pressure. Julie Sousa operates at the center of that shift, turning data into decisions and decisions into products on a global scale. If this episode changed how you think about AI execution, follow the podcast and share it with one leader who still confuses AI strategy with AI impact. And remember, technology doesn't change systems, decisions do. Thank you and bye-bye.